So we have been working, political scientists and comparativists in general have been working with several types of topologies that may stress one dimension over the other, more institutional or not. The one that has gathered a lot of attention is the one developed by Guedes et al. That distinguishes between personalistic, party regimes, military regimes, and monarchies. And the trend that we have been observing in the last few decades and years is that the most common type of regime that exists today are personalistic regimes, personalist regimes, which are regimes that are characterized essentially by the high levels of concentration of power in the hands of just the dictator or one leader, essentially meaning that they control directly and personally the power to make policy decisions and also to make appointments and control the institutions and most especially the security apparatus. So when we move away from typologies and we pay attention to these underlying latent characteristics of authoritarian regimes, the most important, relevant one of those of them that we are paying attention and analyzing, and that has been increasing notably in the last few years, is the degree of personalism that they have. So personalism is a dimension, a latent characteristic that all regimes have, regardless of whether they're more military, party regime, or some other type, okay, that varies over time and across regimes. So that's a worrying process, or a worrying tendency, a trend that we're observing right now that has several consequences that I'll discuss later. Traditionally, most of these dictatorships that end up being highly personalistic have come to power via coup d'etat, okay? Either being junior officers or senior officers that may have different capacities to accumulate power. But now we're also observing a trend in which there are several dictators that manage to accumulate power without having seized power via coup d'etat, for example, via an election, either non-democratic, there are many non-democratic elections across the world, or democratic elections in which they subvert the democratic institutions gradually and they manage to accumulate power over time, this process that we now call democratic erosion or democratic backsliding, in which electoral democracies or liberal democracies end up losing the characteristics that make them full-fledged democracies, so that emerges a new type of regime, a new dictatorship emerges. For some dictators that come to power with a very low level of support and a very weak position vis-a-vis the elite, that they may use this strategy of trying to personalize power as a gamble for resurrection. So the risk of a coup d'etat from the insider is so high that they'd rather risk it and personalize power in a very aggressive way, meaning that they start grabbing the power to make appointments, promotion, and also start purging people from the inside and try to accumulate power as fast as possible in order to survive in power. Other dictators use a more gradual strategy. When they have some higher levels of loyalties, strength, vis-a-vis the ruling coalition, they can negotiate with some groups within the coalition so they can agree to an initial step of power accumulation, which normally entails accumulating power in terms of controlling or getting the power of making appointments to high office, controlling promotion or influencing promotions. And they gradually, over time, they move to other strategies that entail a more direct control or even rigging and circumventing existing institutions. For example, taking personal control of the security apparatus or taking personal control of the party executive if an official party or regime party exists. And of course, traditionally, all dictatorships also relied on repression for maintaining power. And personalistic dictatorships use different kinds of repression. One, given that they have this more direct control of the security apparatus, that they have stacked that security apparatus with loyalists, being co-ethnics or even relatives in command positions, they have a much higher capacity for reactive repression. And hence, sending this credible threat that if there is a potential challenge emerging from society or from inside the regime, that the regime will respond effectively and violently. But at the same time, given that there is this wider use and the spread of new technologies of information and communication, dictatorships are also taking advantage of that in using and developing better tools for preventive repression, meaning surveillance, monitoring, and identifying potential opposition members or potential foes, rivals within the coalition. Okay, so that avoids the use of reactive repression when you can use this other type of repression. That's another sort of trend that we are observing, that regimes are relying more and more as well on those technologies for conducting that kind of repressive behavior. So the internal and the external consequences of the rise of these personalistic dictatorships are many, and none of them are good. At the domestic level, these regimes are associated with a higher risk of not only the use of violent repression, that they react violently to some challenge, for example, mass protest or an uprising, because they have this more tight control of the security apparatus, so they tend to react violently and trying to prevent those challenges from spreading and becoming more important. So we have higher levels of repression. As a result, partially as a result of that, we observe a higher risk of civil war. Okay, so when they become growingly exclusive, so more and more population is excluding from the structures of the regime. When they exclude certain rivals and certain groups from within the institutions, they use violent repression to remain in power. There is a higher risk that violence may escalate into civil war, so that there are a few groups that might consider the only option viable that they have in trying to influence and to change the regime is using an armed violence. At the economic level, these regimes are also associated with higher levels of poverty, economic mismanagement, corruption. Okay, they use power privately to maintain themselves in power, so they distribute rents to the core group of supporters that they have. So policy is dictated not for the sake of providing public goods to the general population, but to survive in power. And that means politically interested manipulation of the economy, okay, using either regulation, taxation, and spending to benefit those inside the regime and the ruler itself at the expense of most of the population. And at the international level, the main characteristic, and that is quite visible right now in the case of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, for example, is that with these leaders in power, the risk of this kind of regime, personalistic regimes initiating an international conflict is very high. So these dictators are likely to initiate international conflicts for several reasons. The first one, the easy explanation, so to speak, is that they are less constrained. They have fewer constraints inside of the regime in terms of another group of elites, being the military, or the party regime that puts a constraint on the decision to initiate a conflict, okay? The second one is that they receive worse information from the inner circle, okay? Those people are not selected because of their capacity and their knowledge, but because of loyalty. And in trying to please the dictator, sometimes they provide information that is not as true, as real, and accurate as they should have in order to make a more informed decision on whether to initiate or even to continue a conflict. And the last element that seems to be mattering here is as well their propensity to make decisions that entail higher levels of risk. So they are less risk-averse leaders. Having come to power via coup d'etat, by the use of violence, or having manipulated electoral results, gives them a perspective of politics that is not that they are afraid of making risky decisions or dangerous decisions. And the last point is that sometimes even these conflicts may have a domestic logic, meaning that the use or the initiation of international conflicts may be an instrument for surviving in power. Okay? The same mechanism for gambling for resurrection, when an embattled ruler is facing growing or mounting opposition inside the regime, they may decide to initiate a conflict in order to send troops that are less loyal to fight and to mobilize the support of other people so that surviving in power becomes more viable, at least in the short term, or even through military victory that may increase the support for the leader in that situation may be a reason for initiating a conflict. We know that traditionally these regimes, personalistic regimes, when they are destabilized from the outside using foreign policy, for example, the use of sanctions or some other strategy, okay, they do not give way to democracy. So when trying to destabilize a personalistic regime, you have to be aware that maybe the result, the outcome that you may get is not a democratic transition, that you may get a new dictatorship. So the only instruments that you can use that may be effective is the ones that empower certain groups or make them change their incentives on whether to support the regime or not, which is something that traditionally sanctions have done. Sanctions by restricting, especially those regimes that are highly dependent on foreign income, from exports from primary commodities, agricultural goods, or natural resources, have been quite vulnerable to the pressure from economic sanctions, okay? Because that may incentivize some elites to defect because they are not receiving the benefits that they used to, because they have some doubts or uncertainty about the duration of the regime, or because that signal of sending sanctions or imposing sanctions against a regime emboldens the opposition. The opposition feels that someone from the outside is actually acting or saying that they disapprove the existence of that regime, okay? And they give them a higher capacity. So personalistic regimes, according to our data, our research, have been relatively vulnerable. We have observed a certain increase in their propensity to break down as a result of sanctions, but again, that does not result in democratization. Other strategies like military intervention have a poor record of success, and especially applied against regimes that have weak institutions, that have a tight control of the security apparatus, does not normally result in democratization. They don't have the conditions for generating a stable democracy afterwards. So more conflict, state failure is more likely to follow. Other strategies like human rights prosecutions, indicting those regimes for having committed certain crimes against humanity, having used repression quite intensely, normally against personalistic regimes give them more incentive to remain in power, to hold tighter to power, and meaning using more intensely more repression and other instruments that they may have. Because power is the best protection against persecution, against the potential punishment from the ICC or other international courts or even domestic courts. So my answer in here would be, we have, or the European Union, or whoever wants to think about it, have to find ways for preventing those kind of dictatorships from emerging in the first place. So once they are in place, they're very difficult to deal with. Even if you manage to destabilize them by cutting ties, restricting the flow of resources, essentially meaning economic sanctions, military interventions are of the picture, in my opinion. Once they're there, they're very difficult to deal with. And if, even as I was saying, if you manage to destabilize them, it's extremely unlikely that what you're going to be getting is a new democracy. So we have to find ways of trying to prevent them from accumulating power, and that's very difficult to find. So what our research is helping in figuring out is by being able to identify those steps that they make, that they adopt in order to accumulate more power gradually, to have an early warning system. So we know that this dictator is going potentially that path of becoming a personalistic dictator. How is it that we can prevent them from the outside? So given the logic of personalism, that the main deterrent against personalizing power is the credible threat of elites staging a coup or threatening the dictator to stage a coup, if that dictator behaves opportunistically, the policy implication of that line of reasoning, of that argument, of that logic under which dictatorships operate, is to find policies that reinforce, that strengthen the role of the elites in controlling and being able to constrain the dictator. That may come at a cost, meaning that the cost is that if that dictator is forced to share power and hence adopt and negotiate a power-sharing agreement with the elites in terms of providing regular, predictable access to power and rents for those elites, you may get an unstable dictatorship. You may be stabilizing a dictatorship, okay? But at the consequence of preventing that dictator accumulates power within his own hands, and as a result, sort of preventing the many negative consequences that come with that. So designing policies that actually strengthen some groups within the regime, within the elite, instead of the opposition, and not the dictator, to prevent that personalism emerges, is something that we need to think very carefully about.